Marcus liked quiet evenings. Not the dramatic kind of quiet you saw in adventure holovids, where the silence meant something dangerous was about to happen. He preferred the comfortable, boring kind of quiet where nothing important happened at all. His apartment floated on the 43rd level of a modest residential tower overlooking the eastern docks of New Alexandria Colony. From his balcony, he could see cargo ships descending through the atmosphere in slow streaks of orange light, their engines glowing like artificial sunsets before disappearing into the docking platforms below. Marcus leaned on the railing, watering a line of stubborn green plants that had no scientific right to survive the colony's recycled soil. "You and I both know you're not supposed to grow here," he muttered to a small tomato plant, "but we've come too far to quit now." The plant, being a plant, offered no opinion. Inside the apartment, an old broadcast radio crackled quietly on the kitchen counter. Marcus liked listening to antique transmissions from the early interstellar days. Most people preferred immersive neural media now, but Marcus enjoyed the strange simplicity of voices traveling through static. A historian was explaining the political consequences of the Orion border wars. Marcus turned the volume down slightly. "Let's keep the galactic trauma at a polite background level tonight." He stepped inside, wiping his hands on a towel. The apartment was small but comfortable. 2 rooms, a narrow kitchen, and walls covered with shelves holding things Marcus had collected over the years. Starship models, mechanical tools, and a few old data tablets he insisted on repairing himself instead of replacing. None of it was impressive. Marcus liked it that way. He had a job maintaining atmospheric sensors for the city grid, which meant most of his work involved climbing maintenance towers and arguing with machines that refused to admit they were broken. It was an honest career. It paid well enough. And most importantly, it never involved royalty, politics, or dramatic life choices. Marcus poured himself a cup of tea and sat down at the small kitchen table. Outside the window, traffic drones moved between buildings like glowing insects. He had just begun the first peaceful sip when someone knocked on the door. Marcus froze. Not because visitors were unusual, because knocking was. In the 23rd century, people rarely knocked anymore. The apartment door had a perfectly functional communication panel that allowed visitors to identify themselves, send a greeting signal, or display their face through the security feed. Knocking meant one of 3 things. The visitor didn't understand technology, the visitor didn't trust technology, or the visitor wanted to be dramatic. Marcus set his tea down slowly. Another knock echoed through the apartment. 3 calm taps. Marcus stared at the door. "Well," he muttered, "this is already suspicious." He walked across the room and glanced at the security panel beside the frame. The display showed nothing. No signal, no identification request, no friendly delivery drone apologizing for arriving late. Just an empty screen. Marcus frowned. "That's not comforting." The knocking came again. Same rhythm, same patience. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. His building was usually quiet, but the docks attracted travelers from dozens of star systems. Sometimes lost visitors wandered into the wrong tower, looking for temporary housing or transport offices. Still, the silence outside the door felt unusual. He pressed the panel to activate the external camera. The screen flickered, then went black. Marcus stared. That's new. The camera system had never failed before. The building maintenance AI took pride in reminding residents that its systems were statistically superior to human reliability. Marcus crossed his arms. So much for statistical superiority. The knocking came again. Marcus sighed. "All right, fine. If this is a neighbor complaining about my balcony plants, we're going to have a very reasonable discussion about agricultural freedom." He unlocked the door. The metal seal hissed softly as it slid open. Marcus pulled the door aside and immediately forgot what he had been planning to say. A woman stood in the hallway. She was tall, composed, and dressed in clothing that looked far too elegant for the worn metal corridors of Marcus's apartment tower. Her dark hair rested over her shoulders, and her calm eyes studied him with quiet patience. At first glance, she looked human. Then Marcus noticed her ears. Long, graceful, and unmistakably alien. Behind her stood 2 figures wearing dark armored suits marked with faint silver patterns that glowed softly along the edges. The armor hummed with the quiet energy of advanced defensive technology. Marcus blinked. His brain attempted to assemble a logical explanation. It failed. Finally, he cleared his throat. If this is about the tomato plant, he said carefully, I can explain. The woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled slightly. I believe, she said gently, you once saved my life. Marcus stared at her. Then he glanced at the armored guards. Then back at the woman. I'm pretty sure, he replied slowly. You have the wrong apartment. Marcus stood in the doorway for several seconds, waiting for the moment when reality would politely correct itself. It did not. The woman remained there, calm and patient, as if standing in the hallway of a slightly confused human apartment was the most natural thing in the universe. Behind her, the two armored figures had not moved a single centimeter. Marcus suspected they might actually be statues with advanced breathing technology. He leaned slightly to the left, looking down the corridor, then slightly to the right, then back at the woman. Okay, Marcus said slowly. Before we continue, I need to confirm something important. She tilted her head slightly. Marcus pointed at himself. You are absolutely certain you meant to knock on this door? Yes, Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. He paused. Because statistically speaking, no one important has ever visited this apartment. The woman's smile grew just a little. That appears to be correct. Marcus rubbed his forehead. You said I saved your life. Yes. He thought about that very seriously, then shook his head. I would definitely remember that. The woman studied his face with a calm curiosity, as if she were comparing it to a memory stored many years ago. Marcus crossed his arms. Look, he continued, I'm not saying I've never helped anyone before. I once helped my neighbor carry a broken cleaning drone down 4 flights of stairs, but that didn't require armored bodyguards. One of the guards shifted very slightly. Marcus noticed. He pointed at the guard. See? Even he agrees this situation is suspicious. The guard did not respond. Marcus looked back at the woman. She seemed amused now, though she was clearly trying not to show it too openly. May I come inside? She asked. Marcus hesitated. His brain ran through several possibilities. Possibility 1. This was some kind of elaborate scam involving extremely well-funded actors. Possibility 2. He had accidentally become involved in a diplomatic situation without filling out the proper forms. Possibility 3. The universe had finally decided his life was too boring. Marcus sighed and stepped aside. Well, if you're going to explain why I apparently saved your life, it would be rude to do it in the hallway. The woman stepped inside. Her guards remained outside like decorative pillars of quiet intimidation. Marcus closed the door slowly. Then he turned and realized something. His small apartment suddenly felt much smaller. The elegant alien woman stood calmly in the center of the living room, looking around with quiet interest at the shelves of mechanical parts and starship models. Her gaze eventually landed on the tomato plants by the balcony door. Marcus noticed. Yes, he said defensively. They are very important. I can see that. Marcus gestured toward the kitchen table. You can sit if you want. The chair is sturdy. I tested it yesterday by accidentally falling into it. She sat gracefully. Marcus returned to the kitchen counter and poured another cup of tea. He placed it carefully in front of her. I should warn you, he said, this tea is either slightly overbrewed or slightly dangerous. The results are still being studied. She accepted the cup politely. Marcus sat across from her and leaned back. All right, he said, let's begin with the obvious question. She waited. Marcus pointed at her ears. You're not from around here. No. And you're absolutely certain I saved your life? Yes. Marcus nodded slowly. Interesting. He tapped the table. Because the list of people I've saved is extremely short. He paused. Actually, I think it might currently be 0. The woman took a small sip of the tea. Her expression remained composed, though Marcus noticed her eyes briefly react to the strength of it. Yes, Marcus said proudly. That's the overbrewed part. She placed the cup down and folded her hands together. My name, she said calmly, is Ilara. Marcus blinked. The name sounded familiar, very familiar. In fact, it sounded like the kind of name people heard in official news broadcasts while eating breakfast. Marcus stared at her. Ilara. Yes. He pointed toward the hallway where the guards were standing. Those guys work for you. Yes. Marcus slowly leaned back in his chair. Then he stared at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. I'm going to ask this very carefully, he said. She waited. You're not about to tell me you're Queen Ilara. She looked directly at him. I am. Marcus did not speak for several seconds. Then he slowly picked up his cup of tea. He drank it. He placed the cup back on the table. Well, he said calmly, that explains the guards. Ilara watched him with quiet curiosity. Marcus leaned forward. Unfortunately, he continued, it does not explain the part where I saved the queen of an interstellar civilization. Ilara studied his face carefully. Then she said softly, 30 years ago, during the war, you hid a frightened alien girl in a storage shed behind your parents' home. Marcus blinked. His brain searched through old memories, dusty ones, the kind that live somewhere far in the back of the mind. Something flickered, a faint memory of muddy shoes, a small figure hiding behind crates, someone whispering because soldiers were walking past outside. Marcus frowned, then looked back at Ilara. Wait. He pointed at her slowly. You're telling me. Marcus leaned forward. You're the kid who kept asking if peanut butter was a weapon. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, as if the answer might suddenly rearrange itself into something more reasonable. It did not. The elegant woman sitting across from him remained very calm, very composed, and very much the same person who had just been identified as the ruler of an interstellar civilization. Marcus slowly leaned back in his chair. That can't be right. Ilara folded her hands on the table. I believe it is. Marcus pointed at her. No, because the girl I remember was about this tall. He held his hand somewhere around chest height. She was covered in dust, she refused to stop asking questions, and she tried to eat an entire jar of peanut butter with a spoon. Ilara's expression softened slightly. That does sound like me. Marcus rubbed his face. And she definitely was not a queen. Not at the time. Marcus sat in silence for several seconds. The quiet hum of the city's atmospheric stabilizers drifted faintly through the walls. Finally, he looked at her again. Okay, he said slowly. Let's assume for a moment that the universe has completely lost its sense of humor, and you really are that kid. Ilara tilted her head slightly. Marcus leaned forward. You're telling me that 30 years ago you were hiding in the supply shed behind my parents' house during the Orion War. Yes. Marcus squinted. You were the one who kept asking if humans always put sugar in bread. Yes. And you were absolutely convinced peanut butter might explode. Ilara nodded once. Marcus slapped the table lightly. I knew it. He pointed at her triumphantly. I told you it wasn't a weapon. Ilara allowed herself a small laugh. It was quiet but genuine. Marcus leaned back again, shaking his head. This is unbelievable. For a moment he was silent, his eyes narrowing as old memories slowly rearranged themselves in his mind. Images that had once seemed insignificant began connecting together. The frightened girl crouched behind crates, the distant sound of military patrol vehicles moving through the street, his younger self whispering instructions that were mostly guesses. Marcus spoke again, slower this time. You stayed there 3 days. Ilara nodded. You brought food from your house. Marcus grimaced slightly. My mother was very confused about the missing sandwiches. You told me humans had secret food rituals. Marcus pointed at her again. That was a tactical distraction. You were asking too many questions. Ilara's smile widened slightly. You also tried to teach me how to watch cartoons. Marcus leaned back proudly. That was cultural diplomacy. You spent 20 minutes explaining why a robotic dog was chasing a flying pizza. Marcus nodded once. That show had a complex narrative structure. Ilara laughed again. Marcus noticed something strange. The queen sitting in his apartment looked very different when she laughed. For a moment the formal distance disappeared, and he could almost see the frightened child she had once been. He scratched the side of his head. Well, I thought you were just a refugee kid. I was. Marcus frowned. Then where do the soldiers fit into this? Ilara's expression grew more serious. They were searching for survivors of my family. Marcus leaned forward again. Your family meaning the royal house? Marcus blinked. Of course it was. He sighed heavily. So let me get this straight. He began counting on his fingers. When I was 8 years old, I accidentally hit a runaway alien princess in a garden shed while eating sandwiches and watching cartoons. Ilara nodded calmly. Yes? Marcus leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Well, he said after a moment, that explains a lot. Ilara raised an eyebrow slightly. Does it? No. Marcus looked back at her. It explains absolutely nothing. He gestured vaguely toward her. You're telling me that the scared kid who didn't understand peanut butter is now the ruler of an entire civilization? Yes. Marcus pointed toward himself. And the human hero who saved you is apparently a guy who spends his evenings arguing with tomato plants. Yes. Marcus crossed his arms. I feel like history has exaggerated certain parts of this story. Ilara watched him carefully. You may not remember it the same way. Marcus shrugged. I remember a kid who looked hungry. That was me. And soldiers walking through the street. Yes. And my brilliant hiding strategy. Ilara smiled faintly. You told me to sit inside an empty fertilizer crate. Marcus raised a finger. That crate had excellent structural integrity. It had ventilation holes. Marcus nodded. See? Thoughtful planning. Ilara studied him quietly for a moment. You risked punishment. Marcus waved that away. I risked my mother asking questions. The soldiers were executing survivors. Marcus paused. The room became quieter for a moment. He looked down at the table. Yeah, he said softly. That part I remember. Outside in the hallway, one of the armored guards shifted slightly. Marcus glanced toward the door, then back at Ilara. So you've been looking for me? For many years. Marcus blinked. You crossed several star systems to find the kid who once hid you in a fertilizer crate. Ilara nodded calmly. Yes. Marcus leaned back again. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he slowly shook his head. You know, he muttered. Most people get thank you notes. Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms folded, staring at the woman across the table, as if she might dissolve into a reasonable explanation if he waited long enough. She did not. Ilara remained exactly where she was, calm and patient, holding the same posture of someone who had spent years sitting through diplomatic negotiations without once flipping a table. Marcus tapped the table with one finger. You've been looking for me. Yes. For 30 years. Yes. Marcus nodded slowly. That seems excessive. Ilara tilted her head slightly. You hid me from soldiers who were executing anyone connected to my family. Marcus waved a hand. I hid a kid in a shed. A shed with poor ventilation. Marcus raised a finger. It had holes. Ilara smiled faintly. Marcus exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. He tried to remember those 3 days more clearly, but the memories came back in strange fragments. A muddy pair of shoes sitting beside the crate. A quiet whisper asking why human bread tasted sweet. The distant hum of patrol drones moving through the sky. Marcus frowned slightly. You barely spoke our language. I had only learned a few phrases. Marcus pointed at her. Your pronunciation of peanut butter was extremely suspicious. Ilara laughed softly. I believed it might be military food. Marcus nodded proudly. It was. Ilara raised an eyebrow. You told me it gave humans the strength to defeat enemies. Marcus shrugged. That part was motivational. For a moment, they both sat quietly. Marcus noticed the way Ilara studied the small objects in his apartment, the starship models, the shelves of tools, the old radio still murmuring faintly from the counter. None of it looked particularly impressive. Certainly not the home of someone who had accidentally influenced a queen. Marcus followed her gaze. Just so we're clear, he said, this is not a royal residence. Ilara looked back at him. I noticed. Marcus gestured vaguely toward the room. You're currently sitting in the strategic center of my entire life. Ilara glanced around again. It appears peaceful. That's the idea. Marcus leaned forward. So let me understand something. She waited. You became queen. Yes. You rebuilt your people after a war. Yes. And during all that time, you kept searching for a human kid who once hid you behind fertilizer bags. Alara nodded. Marcus squinted at her. That sounds like an inefficient use of royal resources. Ilara rested her hands on the table. It was not an official operation. Marcus blinked. You conducted a secret multi-decade search operation? Yes. Marcus leaned back again. Well, he crossed his arms. That's slightly concerning. Ilara watched him calmly. Marcus pointed toward the hallway. Do your guards know you're doing this? They believe I am conducting diplomatic outreach. Marcus stared at her. That might technically be true. Outside the door, one of the armored guards shifted slightly again, the soft hum of his armor briefly vibrating through the wall. Marcus lowered his voice. They look very serious. They are very serious. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Have they always been standing there like decorative statues? Yes. Marcus looked toward the door. Impressive commitment. He returned his attention to Ilara. So what happens now? Ilara studied him carefully. Marcus gestured around the apartment. You found the mysterious human boy who saved your life. He paused. And he turned out to be a sensor technician with a dangerous tea habit. Ilara smiled slightly. Marcus leaned forward again. You came all this way just to say thank you? Ilara hesitated for the first time. The silence stretched for a moment. Marcus noticed it immediately. Oh no, he said quietly. Ilara met his eyes. Marcus pointed at her. That's the face people make when there's a second part. Ilara folded her hands. There is. Marcus sighed deeply. I knew it. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling again. Nothing in the universe is ever simple. Ilara spoke gently. You changed the way I see people. Marcus looked back down at her. That seems like a lot of responsibility for an 8-year-old. You showed me kindness when you had no reason to trust me? Marcus shrugged. You looked hungry. The soldiers were searching the area. Marcus shrugged again. They looked angry. Ilara watched him carefully. Marcus rubbed his face with both hands. All right. He exhaled slowly. So you found me? Yes. And now you're here? Yes. Marcus crossed his arms. And the universe still hasn't explained why. Ilara leaned forward slightly. Her voice became quieter. Because I want you to come with me. Marcus blinked. What? Ilara held his gaze. I want you to join my court. Marcus stared at her. Several seconds passed. Then he slowly pointed at himself. Just to confirm. Ilara nodded once. Marcus tapped his chest. You mean me? Yes. Marcus gestured at the apartment. The man whose biggest responsibility today was watering tomatoes. Yes. Marcus leaned back in his chair again. Then he stared at the ceiling, then back at her. You realize, he said slowly, this might be the worst recruitment strategy in galactic history. Marcus stared at Ilara for several seconds, waiting for the moment when she would smile and say she was joking. She did not smile, she did not blink. She simply watched him with the calm patience of someone who had already spent years waiting for this conversation. Marcus slowly leaned back in his chair. You want me to join your court? Yes. Marcus nodded once, very slowly. Then he pointed toward the kitchen counter. Do you see that kettle? Ilara glanced at it. Yes. That kettle is currently the most powerful authority in this apartment, Marcus said. If it starts making noise, I obey it immediately. Ilara looked back at him. Marcus spread his hands. And now you're telling me the queen of an interstellar civilization wants that person as an advisor? Yes. Marcus sat quietly for a moment. Then he leaned forward again. Are you absolutely certain you found the correct human? Ilara nodded. Marcus scratched the side of his head. I feel like there were probably other children in that city. There were. And none of them hid you in fertilizer crates. Marcus sighed. That crate had good airflow. Ilara smiled faintly. Marcus leaned back again, crossing his arms. Let's talk about your court for a moment. Ilara waited. Marcus pointed at her. You have generals. Yes. Strategists. Yes. Diplomats who probably went to extremely expensive academies. Yes, Marcus tapped the table. And none of those people seemed like a better choice than the guy who once microwaved soup with the lid still on. Ilara tilted her head slightly. You did what? Marcus waved that away quickly. That's not important. Elara folded her hands. You helped me when you had no reason to. Marcus shrugged. You were a kid hiding in a shed. You did not ask who I was. Marcus nodded. I assumed you were someone who needed sandwiches. You did not ask what you would gain. Marcus blinked. Gain? Yes. Marcus leaned forward. Look, when you're 8 years old, the concept of political leverage is not very advanced. Elara studied him quietly. Marcus noticed that look. It was the same look she had earlier when she seemed to be comparing him to an old memory. Finally, he sighed. You're serious? Yes. Marcus pointed toward the hallway again. Your guards are still standing out there. Yes. Marcus shook his head slowly. You brought royal security across multiple star systems to recruit a maintenance technician. Elara nodded calmly. Marcus leaned back in the chair until it creaked slightly. Well, he stared at the ceiling again. This is definitely the strangest job interview I've ever had. Elara remained silent. Marcus looked back down at her. Let me ask you something. She waited. When you imagined finding the boy who helped you, what exactly did you expect? Elara considered the question carefully. I expected someone honest. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's a dangerous expectation. I expected someone who would speak without fear. Marcus laughed softly. You found the right apartment for that? Elara's eyes reflected quiet amusement. Marcus pointed toward her again. But let's be realistic. He gestured around the small room. This is my kingdom. Elara looked around. The plants seem loyal. Marcus nodded proudly. They are extremely difficult to govern. He leaned forward again. You're asking me to leave all this behind. Yes. Marcus frowned slightly. And move into a royal palace where everyone is probably extremely serious. Elara did not answer. Marcus squinted at her. They are extremely serious, aren't they? Yes. Marcus groaned softly. That sounds exhausting. Elara studied him. You would not be expected to behave like them. Marcus blinked. That sounds even more dangerous. Elara tilted her head slightly. Why? Marcus leaned forward. Because if you put a normal person in a room full of powerful officials, one of two things happens. Elara waited. They either become quiet or they become a problem. Elara asked calmly, which would you become? Marcus thought about that. Then he pointed at himself. I would absolutely become a problem. Elara smiled. That is precisely why I came. Marcus stared at her. You're recruiting a problem. Yes. Marcus leaned back again and laughed quietly. Well, he rubbed his face. That explains everything. For a moment, the apartment was silent again except for the faint hum of the city outside. Marcus glanced toward the balcony. The tomato plants were still standing there, quietly minding their own business. He looked back at Elara. You know what the funniest part of this is? What? Marcus pointed at her. You've spent 30 years searching for the boy who helped you. Yes. Marcus shrugged. And you finally found him. Yes. Marcus leaned back in the chair again. And now you're asking him to completely ruin his peaceful life. Elara looked at him calmly. I am asking him to change it. Marcus stared at her. Then he slowly crossed his arms. That sounds suspiciously similar. Marcus sat very still for a moment, arms crossed, eyes half closed, as if he were attempting to calculate the trajectory of his life using invisible equations in the air. The equation was simple. On one side, a quiet apartment, stubborn tomato plants, and a job that mostly involved arguing with malfunctioning atmospheric sensors. On the other side, a queen, an interstellar court, and what was almost certainly a terrifying amount of responsibility. Marcus sighed slowly. You realize, he said, that my biggest professional achievement last month was convincing a humidity sensor it was not, in fact, underwater. Elara rested her hands calmly on the table. That sounds like difficult diplomacy, Marcus pointed at her. That sensor and I negotiated for 3 hours. Elara's lips curved slightly. Marcus leaned back in his chair again, which creaked in quiet protest. Outside the apartment window, a cargo ship roared past the distant skyline, its ion engines leaving a faint ribbon of blue light across the night. Marcus watched it for a moment. Your ships are probably bigger than that one. Yes, Marcus nodded. And faster. Yes. and probably equipped with extremely complicated technology that requires highly trained experts to operate. Yes, Marcus pointed at himself again. And somehow you want the man who still occasionally forgets where he put his toolbox. Ilara watched him carefully. You remember where you hid me. Marcus shrugged. That shed had limited hiding options. You remember the patrol routes. Marcus paused. Okay. That part required some planning. You watched the soldiers for hours. Marcus rubbed his neck slightly. They were not subtle. Ilara leaned forward a little. You were 8 years old. Marcus looked down at the table. For a moment, the humor left his expression. I remember the patrol drones, he said quietly. They hovered above the streets all night. Ilara nodded slowly. Marcus spoke again. You told me they were looking for you. Yes. Marcus sighed. I thought you were exaggerating. Ilara's voice softened. They were not. Marcus sat in silence for a moment. Then he shook his head slightly as if pushing the memory away. Well, he muttered, that explains why my parents grounded me for sneaking out at night. Ilara blinked. You were punished? Marcus waved a hand dismissively. Nothing dramatic. I was banned from watching cartoons for 2 weeks. Ilara tilted her head. That seems severe. Marcus pointed at her. Exactly. The humor slowly returned to the room. Marcus leaned forward again. So let's assume something extremely unlikely happens. Ilara waited. I say yes. Her eyes focused on him. Marcus continued. I leave my peaceful life, board one of your extremely large and intimidating ships, and arrive at your royal court. Yes. Marcus tapped the table. What exactly would I do there? Ilara answered calmly. You would advise me. Marcus frowned. On what? On people. Marcus blinked. People. Yes. Marcus leaned back again. That sounds dangerously vague. Ilara studied him for a moment. In my court, she said slowly, most advisors speak carefully. They calculate every sentence, every opinion. Marcus nodded. That sounds exhausting. They fear consequences. Marcus pointed at himself. I already have consequences. My landlord complains if I water the plants too much, Ilara continued. I need someone who is not afraid to disagree with me. Marcus laughed softly. You came to the correct place. Ilara's eyes reflected quiet amusement. Marcus leaned forward again. You realize I would probably say the wrong thing during extremely important diplomatic meetings? Ilara tilted her head slightly. Why? Marcus shrugged. Because important meetings usually involve people saying complicated things when the simple truth would be easier. Ilara considered that. Marcus continued. And because I have a bad habit of asking questions, nobody wants to answer. Ilara spoke quietly. That is exactly why I trust you. Marcus stared at her. Then he leaned back again, staring at the ceiling. Well, he muttered, that's terrifying. Ilara waited patiently. Marcus remained silent for several seconds. Then he sat up again. All right, he said. One more question. Ilara nodded. Marcus pointed toward the hallway. Your guards. Yes. Marcus lowered his voice slightly. Have they been standing there this entire time? Yes. Marcus blinked. Without moving. Yes. Marcus rubbed his face. That level of discipline is unsettling. Ilara smiled faintly. They are very dedicated. Marcus leaned back again. You know what I think? Ilara waited. Marcus pointed toward the door. They're listening. Ilara said nothing. Marcus nodded slowly. Yes, definitely listening. He raised his voice slightly. Hello, mysterious armored people in the hallway. Silence. Marcus nodded again. Extremely professional. Ilara laughed softly. Marcus leaned forward. You see? This is what I'm talking about. What? Marcus gestured around the apartment. This is the kind of behavior your royal court will experience if I join it. Ilara's eyes shone with quiet amusement. Marcus spread his hands. I am not a diplomat. Ilara nodded. I know. Marcus leaned closer. I am barely organized. I know. Marcus sighed deeply. Well, he rubbed the back of his neck again. This is the part where life becomes complicated. Ilara studied him carefully. Marcus looked toward the balcony again. The tomato plants stood quietly in the moonlight. He stared at them for a moment. Then he looked back at Alara. "If I come with you," he said slowly, "I'm bringing those plants." Alara blinked once. Then she nodded. "That can be arranged." Marcus leaned back in the chair again. "That's a surprisingly strong negotiation strategy." Marcus stood on his balcony with his arms resting on the railing, staring out over the glowing skyline of New Alexandria Colony. The city hummed quietly beneath him. Cargo ships moved through the night sky like slow-burning stars, their engines whispering as they descended toward the docking platforms. Somewhere far below, automated trams slid through illuminated streets, while maintenance drones drifted between towers like silent mechanical birds. It was the same view Marcus had seen every evening for years, but tonight it looked different. Behind him, inside the apartment, Queen Alara sat calmly at his kitchen table, studying one of the small starship models on the shelf. The soft light from the kitchen lamp reflected faintly along the elegant curve of her long ears. Marcus exhaled slowly. "You know," he said without turning around, "most people get a quiet, midlife crisis." Alara looked up from the model. "Do they?" "Yes," Marcus replied. "They buy strange vehicles or start exercising aggressively." He gestured vaguely toward the sky. "They do not usually get recruited by an alien queen." Alara smiled faintly. Marcus remained silent for a moment longer, watching another cargo ship descend toward the docks. 30 years ago, those same skies had been filled with warships. He remembered flashes of it now more clearly than he had in years. The distant thunder of orbital cannons, the low hum of patrol drones scanning the streets, the small, frightened girl crouched in the shed behind his parents' house. Marcus pushed himself away from the railing and walked back inside. Alara watched him quietly. "You were not expecting this," she said. Marcus sat down across from her again. "That is the most accurate statement anyone has made today." Alara folded her hands. Marcus studied her face for a moment. The scared child he had hidden in the shed was gone. In her place sat someone who carried the weight of an entire civilization. But there were still traces of that same person in her eyes. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "I spent most of my life believing that moment barely mattered," he said. Alara listened. Marcus shrugged slightly. "I helped a kid hide for a few days. That's all it felt like." Alara spoke quietly. "It changed everything for me." Marcus rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I suppose life is strange like that." He glanced toward the balcony again. "You know what the weirdest part is?" "What?" Marcus pointed toward the tomato plants. "I thought those were the most important things I'd ever grown." Alara looked at the plants. "They seem healthy." Marcus nodded. "Very stubborn." He paused. "Like certain queens." Alara laughed softly. Marcus looked back at her. "You spent 30 years searching for someone who didn't even realize he had done anything important." "Yes." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "And now you want that person advising you?" "Yes." Marcus sighed slowly. "Well," he rubbed the back of his neck, "that's still an extremely questionable decision." Alara studied him carefully. "You said earlier that most people in my court are serious." Marcus nodded. "You need someone who will speak honestly." Marcus leaned back again. "And apparently that someone is the man who once convinced a future queen that peanut butter was a strategic weapon." Alara smiled. Marcus looked toward the hallway where the guards still stood. "They're still there, aren't they?" "Yes." Marcus shook his head. "Incredible discipline." He stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, pouring another cup of tea. He placed a second cup in front of Alara. "Careful," he said. "This batch may be stronger than the previous one." Alara took the cup. Marcus sat again. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus finally sighed. "Well," he said, "this is definitely not how I expected tonight to end." Alara waited. Marcus leaned back, crossing his arms. "I spent years fixing atmospheric sensors." He gestured toward the sky. "Meanwhile, you rebuilt an entire civilization." Alara shook her head gently. "I did not do that alone." Marcus nodded. "But you carried it?" Alara did not deny it. Marcus stared at the table for a moment. Then he looked up again. "You know what I realized tonight?" "What?" Marcus smiled slightly. "I didn't save a queen." Elara watched him. I saved a scared kid who needed sandwiches. Elara's expression softened. Marcus shrugged. And apparently that kid grew up to run half the galaxy. Elara tilted her head. Not half. Marcus waved that away. Details. He leaned forward. But if that kid is still the same person, then maybe the guy who helped her should at least hear what she has to say. Elara's eyes brightened slightly. Marcus raised a finger. However, she waited. Marcus pointed toward the balcony. The plants come with me. Elara nodded immediately. Marcus nodded back. Good. He leaned back in his chair again. Well then. He looked at the door, then at Elara, then back at the door. I suppose we should tell the statues in the hallway that their mission was successful. Elara smiled. Marcus stood up and walked to the door. He opened it. The two armored guards immediately straightened. Marcus crossed his arms and studied them. You've both been standing there for several hours. Yes, one of them replied calmly. Marcus nodded. Impressive. He gestured behind him toward Elara. Well, he sighed, looks like I'm going with the queen. The guards exchanged the smallest possible glance. Marcus pointed at them. But just so we're clear. They waited. Marcus grinned. If anything explodes on that spaceship, I'm blaming the peanut butter.